The wind was screaming through the broken mountains of ice 13, and everything around was white and silent and dead, and the snow was falling like dust from the sky, and it felt like the world had no life left in it anymore. The soldier moved slowly across the frozen ground with his eyes scanning every direction, and his rifle tight in his hands, and the cold biting through even the thick armor he wore. His name was Jackson, and he had been on this frozen planet for 6 months now, and he had seen more snow and more death than he ever thought possible, and still each day brought something worse than the last. He was alone today, and the wind made it hard to hear, and the sky above was a dark blue like it was holding the storm in its lungs and waiting to spit it down on him. Without warning, Jackson walked carefully past the burned remains of a small alien outpost, and the metal was twisted and black from old fire, and he could still smell something that reminded him of melted plastic. And Blood Command had said there were no survivors and no reason to search, but Jackson did not trust Command anymore, and he knew that sometimes the things they wanted to forget were the things that needed remembering most. His boots sank deeper into the snow as he crossed a broken hill, and at the bottom he saw something that stopped him cold and made him grip his rifle tighter and squint through the frost on his visor. There was a glow behind a rock, and not the kind of glow from a machine or a signal, but something soft and flickering like the last bit of life refusing to die. Jackson moved closer, and his breath turned into thick clouds as he exhaled slowly and carefully, and every sound of his step was lost in the wind. When he reached the rock, he saw a figure curled against the stone, and another smaller figure beside it, and both were thin and shaking and wrapped in what looked like scraps of cloth and hope. They were aliens, blue skin bruised and cracked from the cold, and hair frozen and stuck to their faces, and the smaller one could barely open her eyes as she shivered against the larger one, who held her tight with both arms. The mother looked up, and Jackson saw her eyes, and they were not the eyes of an enemy or a monster or a killer. They were the eyes of someone who had lost everything and was holding on only for the sake of the little one in her arms. She tried to speak, but her lips were blue and broken, and the wind almost swallowed her words. But Jackson heard them, and they sank into his chest like a blade made of sorrow. "We just want a warm meal, please." Her voice was not loud, but it was full of something stronger than a scream. Desperation. Jackson stood there frozen like the snow around him, and everything inside him was shouting at once, and none of it made sense. These were aliens. They were supposed to be the enemy. But this was not war. This was something else, something older and more powerful than politics and weapons. This was survival. He looked down at the little girl and saw how her tiny fingers were stiff with frost, and her legs bare and red, and how her chest barely moved with each breath. Dropped to one knee and pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around the child, and the mother tried to pull her back, but she was too weak, and Jackson shook his head and spoke gently. "No harm," he said, "only help." The mother looked at him with wide eyes full of fear and confusion, and maybe a little hope, and Jackson reached into his pack and pulled out the last protein bar he had and held it out. The child blinked slowly and took it, and her tiny hands trembled so much the bar nearly fell, but the mother helped her hold it and break it in two, and they both ate in silence as Jackson watched. The snow kept falling, and the sky grew darker, and Jackson knew he had to decide fast. His radio was crackling with static, and he could report them now, and they would come and take them away, and they would never be seen again, or he could help. He looked at the mother again, and her eyes were still locked on his face, and they said nothing, but they asked everything. "Please." He stood up and motioned for them to follow, and the mother hesitated, but then she gathered her daughter and rose and stumbled forward, and Jackson helped them both walk as the snowstorm began to howl louder around them. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know what this meant, but he knew one thing: no one should freeze to death alone, not even an alien, and sometimes a warm meal was more powerful than a bullet. Asterisk. The snowstorm outside was still screaming against the walls of the abandoned cargo shelter, but inside there was only silence broken by the soft sound of breath and the quiet hum of an old heater. Jackson had managed to repair just enough to warm the space around them. The alien mother sat with her daughter, wrapped tightly in his emergency blanket, and the little one had stopped shaking now, and her eyes were finally closed in sleep, and her lips had color again, and Jackson stood at the edge of the room watching them, as if trying to understand what he had just done. He was a soldier trained to follow orders, trained to fight and kill if needed, trained to see aliens as threats, as dangers, as enemies. But when he looked at that child, when he heard the mother's voice, when she said please, when her hands were trembling in the cold, there was no threat, only need, only desperation. Jackson walked slowly to a broken supply locker in the corner and pulled out a water canister, half frozen but still good, and brought it back, setting it down near them without a word. And the mother looked up, and this time she did not flinch. She touched her hand to her chest slowly, and then reached out and touched the side of the water canister, her head lowering just slightly in what he understood as thanks, and something inside him shifted again. Girl stirred, and her small hand clutched the corner of Jackson's jacket, which he had draped over her earlier. And he felt the pull of something deeper than orders, deeper than war. They are not enemies, he thought, they are survivors. Sat down on the floor across from them, and spoke slowly, using the most simple words he could think of, hoping they might understand. What is your name? He asked, not expecting an answer. The mother looked at him for a long time, then pointed to herself and said in a soft voice, Mirren, and then pointed to the girl and said, Scylla Mirren. And Scylla, Jackson repeated, and he nodded, and they seemed to understand, and the girl gave the smallest of smiles, and it broke something open in his chest like a wound made of warmth. There were questions in his mind, now heavy questions, thick questions, like fog questions that did not leave space for comfort. Why were they here alone? Where was their people? What had happened to them? He reached into his pack and pulled out his old datapad, the screen cracked from a past patrol, and opened a secure file hidden from command, and started a scan to match the alien biometrics, just to understand what species they were, what threat level they might be listed as. The result came back, and Jackson stared at the screen for a long time without moving, and the heater buzzed quietly in the corner as if it too was holding its breath. Species, class, civilian designation, exiled from primary conflict. Zone, region marked as non-combatant, medical priority during wartime. They were not soldiers, not spies, not even citizens of the core alien alliance. They were refugees. Worse than that, they were marked for extermination by multiple sides, labeled as weak, useless, dangerous, simply for existing in the wrong place with the wrong kind of blood. Jackson looked up at Mirren, and she looked back, and her eyes told him that she already knew what he had just discovered. Her people had not fled the war, they had been erased by it, and yet she still held her daughter close. She still walked through the ice barefoot. She still whispered please to someone who pointed a weapon at her. He turned off the datapad and tossed it aside, and stared at the flickering heater flame, because he could not look her in the eyes anymore without feeling the weight of what had been done in his name, in his uniform, under his flag. Command had said eliminate threats. Command had said aliens are the enemy, but this was not a threat. This was a mother. This was not an enemy. This was a girl who had smiled even after starving for days. He stood and walked to the corner where his communicator rested, and picked it up and stared at the blinking light, waiting for him to report. He turned it over in his hands. All code, and folded it over and stared at the blinking light, waiting for him to book or board. He had to do was speak, and a retrieval unit would be dispatched within hours, and these two would be taken away and never seen again. Or he could stay silent. He could protect them. He could learn the truth. Placed the communicator back down slowly and turned back to them, and Mirren was watching, and though she said nothing, her expression was different now, softer, maybe trusting, maybe afraid, maybe both. Jackson pulled out another ration and handed it to her, and she took it gently and broke it in half, giving the bigger piece to her daughter first, and only after that did she eat. And in that moment, Jackson saw something stronger than any weapon or army. He saw love, and he knew he was no longer just a soldier on patrol. He had become something else, something dangerous, something human. Long before the snow swallowed her footsteps, long before the sky turned gray, and the silence took away the sound of her people. There was a forest filled with music and color and wind that smelled of sweet fruit and warm light that kissed their skin without burning it. Myron remembered it not in full images but in pieces like broken glass held together by hope and memory, and she remembered laughter in the trees and long tables of food and voices that never shouted, only sang. Her people were not warriors, they were makers. They grew things, they healed things. They told stories not to teach war, but to teach kindness. And they believed in quiet, not weakness, in peace, not surrender, in love, not fear. They lived hidden in the valleys between the larger worlds, untouched by the greed of empires or the fire of weapons. But nothing hidden stays safe forever. And when the sky burned red for the first time, they did not run because they did not understand. They did not fight because they had never been taught how. The fire came fast, and from the stars and the metal ships cracked the sky open, and the voice that spoke from the speakers called them trespassers and parasites and invaders on their own soil, and it did not ask for surrender. It asked for silence, and when they did not answer fast enough, it gave them silence by force. Mirren ran through the chaos with her daughter in her arms, and her feet cut open on sharp ground, and her lungs full of ash, and she saw the trees fall, and the rivers boil and the songs stop, and she did not cry, because she had no time left for crying, only running. They hid inside caves for days while the ground shook and strange machines scanned everything that moved, and Mirren pressed her hand over Sila's mouth just to keep the sound of her breath from being found. They escaped on an old shuttle meant for farming transport, not spaceflight, and the systems barely worked, and the navigation was broken, and the fuel was almost nothing, but the stars still took them in, and for a while they drifted between forgotten rocks and frozen planets, hoping to land somewhere that would not burn them. But war travels faster than light, and there was nowhere left untouched when they found Ice 13. They thought it was death, but it became their shelter, and though the wind tore at their skin and the cold bit into their bones, it was better than fire and silence and smoke. Each day Mirren searched for food, and each night she held her daughter close and whispered old songs, not to remember, but to survive, and she knew one day they would be found, and maybe that was fate, or maybe it was just the math of suffering. But then the soldier came. She had seen soldiers before through the cracks of rocks and from behind dead trees, and they always looked the same: hard eyes, cold armor, loud voices. But this one was different. He had eyes that looked confused instead of cruel, and when she said the words she had saved for her final breath, he did not shoot. He gave his jacket, he gave his food, he gave his silence. Now they were here in the warmth of a dying heater, and Scylla was asleep, and Mirren watched him move across the room like he was fighting something inside himself, and she wondered if he had lost someone too, or if he was just waking up for the first time. She wanted to speak more, wanted to tell him everything, wanted to show him the tree carvings in her memory and the way the wind once danced through the blue leaves, but her words were broken and his language sharp and foreign like cold metal. So instead she reached into the cloth she had wrapped around her waist and pulled out a tiny carved piece of wood shaped like a flower with 7 petals, and she offered it to him with both hands. Jackson looked at the carving and did not take it right away, and then slowly reached out and held it in his fingers and turned it over and saw the tiny details burned into it. By hand, with care and time and love, he nodded and slipped it into the inner pocket of his armor, and Mirren felt something shift in the space between them, like a door opening, like a wall falling, like a breath being held and finally released. He was no longer just the one who gave, he was now the one who carried. She looked down at Scylla and thought of all the stories she had never told her, and all the names of stars she would now have to teach alone, and all the quiet that still waited in her chest, ready to turn into a scream if this moment was only a dream. But Jackson was still there, still watching, still silent, and that silence was no longer the silence of fire and ships and death. It was the silence of listening. It was the silence of choice. The wind outside had gone quiet for the first time in days, and Jackson knew something was wrong, because Ice 13 never stayed quiet unless something worse was coming in silence. Here was never peace, it was a warning. He stood near the door of the shelter staring at the horizon through a cracked window while inside Mirren stirred restlessly beside her sleeping daughter, and the heaters flicker cast shadows that looked like moving hands reaching for things they could not touch. There was a sound now, not loud, but sharp like a crack in the sky, like the planet had inhaled and was waiting to exhale, and Jackson raised his scope and scanned the ridge above the valley, and what he saw made his breath lock in his chest like ice. It was tall and cloaked in something that shimmered like oil over metal, and its feet left no prints in the snow, and its mask reflected no light, and Jackson had never seen this one before, but every part of his body knew exactly what it was. A bounty hunter, not human, not from the Alliance, either something older, something trained for only one purpose, something that did not sleep or ask questions or leave trails, only followed signals and took lives and left. Silence behind Jackson turned from the window and crossed the room in 2 long steps, grabbing his pack and weapon while Mirren sat up quickly, her eyes wide and alert, and without speaking. She already knew it had found them. He handed her a small flare gun and pointed to the back wall where a tunnel led through the rock to the old mining shafts, and he knelt beside Sela and gently shook her awake, and the child opened her eyes slowly and blinked at the fear around her. No words were spoken, no cries or screams, only movement, fast and quiet, like animals that knew the sound of death when it walked. Near outside, the hunter moved without sound, its cloak adapting to the wind, its body shifting slightly as it scanned the shelter, and the faint trail of energy left behind by Mirren and her daughter lit up like fire in its visor. It moved faster now inside. Jackson stood between the main entrance and the others, and he watched the door and aimed his rifle and took a slow breath in and held it like it might be the last full breath he ever took. The door exploded inward without a warning, and the cold rushed in like a scream, and the light from the outside was blinding white, and then swallowed instantly by the shadow that stepped through. The hunter was tall, taller than any human, and its armor hissed with heat and cold at once, and its weapon was already charging with a sound like glass shattering very slowly, and its gaze locked onto Jackson and paused. Then it moved. Jackson fired 3 times and all 3 shots hit, but the creature barely staggered, and then it was upon him. In the room became chaos. They crashed into the wall, and the heater burst into sparks and light, and Mirren grabbed her daughter and ran into the tunnel while Jackson fought to hold his ground against something that did not bleed and did not feel. He kicked the hunter back and rolled to the side, grabbing a shard of metal from the floor and hurling it like a blade, and it struck the mask and cracked part of it, revealing one yellow eye that did not blink. The hunter raised its arm and launched a net of glowing wire toward the tunnel entrance, but Mirren turned just in time and fired the flare gun, and the small red spark hit the wire's middle and exploded into light and heat, and the net burned away into dust. The hunter turned its head slowly and took 1 step forward, but Jackson was already moving again, this time with a long metal pipe from the broken bed, and he slammed it into the back of the creature's legs, and it fell for half a second, enough time for Jackson to fire again, this time at the joint, and its armor. Sparks flew, and the hunter let out a sound that was not pain but rage, and it turned on him and grabbed his arm and twisted, and there was a crack in Jackson's shoulder that made the world flash white for a moment. Still he held on, still he fought, because behind him was not a mission, behind him was not a flag, behind him was a mother and a child, and something more important than orders or rules or survival. Behind him was the last light of something good. Hunter raised its blade, and Jackson saw it coming, and he did not move because there was no time left. Then the flare gun fired again from the tunnel and struck the ceiling, and the stone above the doorway collapsed down onto the hunter's back, and it was buried in ice and rock, and the silence returned for just 1 breath. Jackson crawled toward the tunnel holding his arm and his side, and when he reached the edge, Mirren pulled him inside, and for the first time he saw her eyes not as desperate or afraid, but full of fire. She had protected him, she had fought. They moved deeper into the tunnels, leaving the ruined shelter behind, The snow outside began to fall again, soft and slow and cold, and somewhere under the ice the hunter stirred again. The light above him was too bright and too white, and the air smelled like metal and memory, and Jackson sat straight in his chair, hands cuffed behind his back, while voices filled the room like echoes bouncing off glass walls, never quiet, never kind. He had not slept in 2 days, not since the ship arrived, not since they were taken from the ice and split apart by armed hands, and cold orders and silence once again became the only thing Mirren had to hold on to. The tribunal sat in a raised ring above him, men and women in uniforms without wrinkles, faces without warmth, eyes that did not blink often and did not soften ever, and their screens flickered with reports and footage and still frames of fire and snow, and 2 figures curled together beneath a human jacket. He heard his name spoken, not as a name, but a case number, a violation, a betrayal, and he heard the words: unauthorized contact, harboring enemy presence, disobeying direct command, and each one was carved in ice, not anger, because anger required feeling, but ice because that is what bureaucracy used to kill slowly. He looked at the man speaking, the lead voice from Central Command, tall, sharp voice, practiced like a blade, and the questions came fast and sharp, and they wanted simple answers, yes or no. Did you know they were alien? Did you bring them into your shelter? Did you feed them? Did you lie to your superior officer? Yes, yes. His answers were steady, but his voice was low, not weak, but worn, like something that had been used too many times and could no longer pretend to be new. Then came the final question, the one they all leaned in to hear, the one that would decide everything, the one that would weigh more than rules, or rank, or oath. Why not how, or when, or where, but why? And Jackson looked up at them, and in that moment he was no longer a soldier, or a number, or a case. He was just a man. He opened his mouth and spoke, not fast, not slow, just real, and the room did not interrupt, because truth does not need volume to be heard. Because she was a mother, he said, and she was holding her daughter, and she asked for food, not revenge, not safety, not weapons, just food and warmth. And if that makes her my enemy, then maybe I do not know what side I am on anymore. They were not fighters, they were not soldiers, they were not carrying weapons, they were carrying fear and hunger. And when I looked in her eyes, I did not see an alien, I saw someone trying to protect what little she had left. He paused, not because he was unsure, but because some truths must be allowed to breathe before they land. You taught us that humanity is what separates us from them, but I think humanity is not about biology, it is about choice, and I made a choice to be human when no one else was watching, and I will not say sorry for that. The tribunal whispered among themselves, and Jackson's cuffs felt tighter, even though they had not moved, and outside the glass wall, the stars were silent and cold and distant, and behind another door in another room, Mirren sat with her daughter, waiting, without knowing what words were being used to decide their future. A woman in a silver coat stood and read from a list of offenses, each one matched with a punishment, and each punishment ending with the word removal, and the word dishonor, and the word discharge. And Jackson listened and nodded, because he already knew how it would end. But then an older officer stood from the back row and asked for the footage to be played again, the one from the soldier's body cam, the one where Mirren says please, the one where Scylla takes the ration bar with shaking hands, the one where Jackson wraps the jacket around her without saying a word, and in the silence that followed, the officer spoke only one sentence: if that was not humanity, I do not know what is. The others were silent again. Jackson was released from the chair, but not from the charges, and they said the final decision would come soon, and he was led down a quiet hallway, and the guard beside him did not speak but did not sneer either, which was something. They brought him to a small waiting room where Mirren sat holding Scylla, who was asleep again, this time in a proper blanket. Not a scrap, not a rag, a real blanket, and she looked up when he entered, and for the first time since the ice, there was no fear in her eyes, only waiting. He sat down beside them, and she reached out slowly and touched his shoulder, gently just above the bruise where the hunter had slammed him, and he nodded once, and she nodded back, and for a moment, no one needed words. In Another room, voices would rise again, and papers would be signed and futures decided. But here, in this room, was a man who had chosen to break a rule for something bigger than war, and a mother who had learned that sometimes the enemy wears kindness, and a child who was still alive because someone made the wrong choice for the right reason. Asterisk. The stars above the holding station blinked slowly, as if they too were unsure whether they should stay or vanish, and inside the cold gray halls, time moved like water through cracks, never fast, never still, always leaking. Jackson walked down the corridor with Mirren beside him, and Scylla in her arms, asleep again, too small for all she had seen, too quiet for all she had survived, and the walls around them whispered nothing, as if even metal knew when to stay silent. They had been released from custody, not pardoned, not welcomed, just quietly allowed to leave with conditions attached and warnings whispered, and eyes that never stopped watching. They were being sent to Refuge Sector 9, a settlement made for aliens who had nowhere else to go, a place humans did not visit, a place where names turned into numbers and stories, into silence and safety, into something that only meant not dying. Jackson was told to escort them there personally because no one else volunteered, and command thought it fitting that the man who broke protocol should be the one to deliver the outcome. He said yes, not because he agreed, but because saying no would mean leaving them alone again, and alone was something Mirren had already endured too many times. The transport ship was waiting cold and quiet, and its engines hummed with the kind of sound that made you think of endings, not beginnings, and Jackson helped Mirren board, carrying the few supplies they had been given, along with a bag of rations and one clean blanket. Silas stirred once and looked up at him, and her eyes were half open, but her hand reached out to touch his wrist, and then fell back down gently, and that one moment said more than any thank you ever could. Inside the ship, Mirren sat down slowly, and Jackson took the seat across from her, and the door sealed behind them with a hiss, like a breath being taken in and never let out again. The flight was short, but silent, and Mirren did not speak, and Jackson did not try to fill the quiet, because some silences were not meant to be broken, and some pain could not be fixed, only carried. When they landed, the gate opened into a place that looked more like a prison than a home. Fences made of wire, watchtowers with blinking lights, narrow streets filled with faces that had forgotten how to hope. A guard came to greet them and took their documents without looking at their faces, and gave Mirren a tag with a number, and pointed to a building at the far end of the row, and said that was where they would sleep. Jackson watched as Mirren held Scylla closer and walked toward the shelter, and every step looked heavier than the last, as if the air itself was pushing her down, and the people around them did not stare. They just looked through like shadows looking at ghosts. He wanted to follow, but the order was clear: return immediately after delivery. Do not enter the alien zone. Do not make contact. Do not stay. He stood at the gate for a long time, watching as the night fell over the camp and the lights flickered on, and the cold wind began to rise again, and his hands clenched at his sides, not from cold, but from something else. He turned to leave, but then he heard footsteps running behind him, and when he looked back, it was Mirren alone without her daughter, her face pale, her breath sharp, her voice cracking, as she said only one word: please. She grabbed his hand and placed something small and cold in it, the carved wooden flower he once carried, now returned with purpose, and then she spoke quickly, her words broken but clear. They will take her tomorrow, they said. Too young to be alone, too alien to be safe. They will move her somewhere else, somewhere without me, and I cannot stop them. Voice trembled and her hands shook, and her eyes begged without tears, because she had already cried everything long ago, and Jackson understood in that moment exactly what she was asking. Shook his head, not in refusal, but in disbelief, because the meaning was too much, too fast, too heavy, and she placed both hands on his chest and looked up at him and said what only a mother could say: keep her safe. Then she turned and ran before he could answer, before he could stop her, before he could find better words, and by the time he called her name, she was already walking into the building, and the door was closing. And the night swallowed her whole. The alarm started 10 minutes later. Not loud but sharp and fast, and the guards ran toward the back of the camp where the power lines sparked and the cold storage unit had caught fire, and the smoke climbed into the sky like a black flag waving goodbye. Jackson stood there with Sela, now in his arms, her body wrapped tight in the blanket Mirren had left behind, and the carved flower held in her fingers, and her face pressed against his shoulder, and her voice saying one word softly again and again, "Mama." He did not cry, because soldiers do not cry and fathers do not cry, and maybe he was becoming both and neither at once, and all he could do was hold her tighter and whisper back the only thing he knew for sure: "You are safe," and somewhere far above them, beyond the smoke and the stars and the silence, maybe something listened. The snow had stopped falling weeks ago, but Jackson could still feel it sometimes in the quiet moments between footsteps and the weight of silence after small laughter in the way. The air cooled just before the sun rose. The new colony was small, barely standing, and the walls were made of old metal and soft wood, and every creak sounded like history being bent into something that could survive again. Sila was asleep in the corner, wrapped in a warm blanket, one that did not come from ration packs or emergency kits, but from a real home with stitched corners and colors, chosen not for function but for comfort. And Jackson watched her breathe with the slow peace only children still learning how to dream could keep. The colony had no name, not yet, just numbers on files and codes on crates. But people here called it Nest, not because it was big or strong or safe, but because here someone was always watching, someone was always near, someone was always ready to cover someone else with wings made of action, not feathers. Jackson walked to the stove, which still smoked a little from the morning meal, and stirred the pot with the slow rhythm of someone who had learned patience the hard way, and the smell rising was soft and warm and full of things he once thought he would never care about again. He'd left the service without protest, without medals, without ceremony. Just a quiet signature and a longer silence, and no one had tried to stop him, because no one knew what to say to the man who chose warmth over war. The fire cracked, and Sila opened her eyes slowly and sat up, rubbing her face with one small hand, the other still clutching the wooden flower that never left her side, not when she slept, not when she bathed, not when she sat outside watching the sky, as if waiting for a shape. She remembered Jackson smiled at her, not the kind of smile that needs teeth, just the kind that carries light, and she smiled back and walked to the table where a bowl waited and a chair had already been pulled out for her. She climbed up carefully, the way she did everything now, with quiet steps and soft eyes, and when he placed the warm bowl in front of her, her fingers touched the rim like it was made of treasure, and her lips moved. But her voice was a whisper warm. He nodded and sat across from her, and together they ate. Without words, because some meals are not about talking, they are about healing, and every bite was a memory read in every spoon, a scar softened. Outside the colony, others were working planting systems, setting up water lines, reinforcing the walls, and all of them had their own stories, and none of them asked about Sila, because they already knew whatever needed knowing and whatever they didn't know they respected. After the meal, Sila helped wash the bowls, standing on a crate beside the basin, her hands small and clumsy but determined, and Jackson stood beside her, handing her the cloth, letting her do it herself, because that is how she would grow, not by being shielded, but by being trusted. Later that evening, they sat near the small lamp beside the sleeping mats, and Jackson opened the old book he had found in a supply bin weeks ago, a storybook with missing pages and faded ink, and Sila listened with her head resting on his arm and her eyes half closed. He did not read every word, because some were too hard or too strange or too broken, but she did not care, because the voice was steady and the warmth was real, and sometimes stories do not need to be whole to be enough. When the light flickered and the wind outside shifted just a little, Sila whispered something that made Jackson pause. "Do you think she sees us?" Jackson looked at her, and at the flower in her hand, and at the stars outside the window, and he did not answer right away, because some questions do not need truth, they need belief. Nodded slowly and brushed her hair back and said, "Maybe she watches every night when the wind is quiet and the sky is soft. Maybe she watches and smiles and says that you are safe. Scylla nodded too, and curled closer, and he pulled the blanket over her shoulders and stayed there, beside her as her breath slowed and her hand relaxed, and the flower dropped gently onto the floor later. He would write a small note in the corner of the colony record, not an official report, not a log, just a message today. She smiled before eating and said thank you without fear. And below that another line, she just wanted a warm meal, and now she has one, and she is not alone, and neither am I.